How do you explain her?
Kobe Bryant with a ponytail. Seriously, like apex predator, great basketball player who wants to steal your soul.
Every building she goes into is a different energy.
Caitlin Clark.
Caitlin Clark.
Caitlin Clark.
Caitlin Clark.
Caitlin Clark.
What's up, you guys? I'm Cordy, and welcome back to TFD. Today, we are going to revisit that ESPN article we already touched on, the one titled WNBA CBA Negotiations at an Impasse, 11 Things That Got Us to This Point. And honestly, I want to go a little deeper into it, because for the first time ever, ESPN is openly admitting what a lot of us have been saying for a while now. Caitlin Clark is the driving force behind the recent rise of this sport. It only took 2 seasons for that to become undeniable, which is kind of wild when you think about it. The article was written by Alexa Philippou, who has been covering the WNBA nonstop. Credit where it's due, she's been on this beat relentlessly. But there's been a lot of discourse around certain parts of this article, and since we've been talking so much about these WNBA CBA negotiations, I figured it was worth breaking this down together. Because let's be clear, this CBA is the biggest thing to ever happen in women's basketball, period. This is the most money that has ever been on the table for WNBA players. The demands are larger than anything we've ever seen before. So the real question is, how did we get here? According to the article, it all really starts back in January of 2020. On January 14th, 2020, the WNBA and the WNBPA announced what they called a groundbreaking, landmark collective bargaining agreement. And at the time, it was groundbreaking. Back then, players were celebrating salaries that looked tiny compared to what's being discussed today. Just think about this for a second. Caitlin Clark is currently on a deal that's roughly $70,000 per year. That type of salary structure was considered a major win in 2020. A max salary just over $200,000 was viewed as a huge step forward. Fast forward 6 years, and now we're talking about average salaries around $500,000 and max salaries north of $1 million. That is an insane shift in a very short period of time. The tides have completely turned. Another important part of that 2020 CBA was prioritization. This was the system that required players to put the WNBA ahead of overseas commitments. And here's my prediction. Maybe not in this CBA, but definitely in the next one. Prioritization is going to turn into full-on exclusivity if salaries keep rising. There's just no realistic scenario where players get the kind of money they're asking for, along with a favorable revenue split, and still have complete freedom to do whatever they want in the offseason. With prioritization, the rule is basically this. If you're playing overseas and your season runs late, you still have to be back for WNBA training camp. The WNBA comes first. If your WNBA team goes deep into the playoffs, you might miss obligations with your overseas team. That's how it works now. But remember, back in 2020, there was no Unrivaled. There was no Athletes Unlimited. There was no Project B looming in the background. Players either played in the WNBA or went overseas. That was it. Then you get to June of 2020, when the WNBA announced the bubble season. Looking back, 2020 feels like a fever dream. Bubble basketball was bizarre across the board. And if you remember, a lot of viral videos came out of the WNBA bubble. The hotel situations, the food complaints, the overall accommodations. When you compared it to the NBA bubble, it wasn't even close. The WNBA players were clearly getting the short end of the stick. All of that context matters when you look at where we are now, because this current WNBA CBA fight didn't just come out of nowhere. It's been building for years.
Alexa Philippou also points out that this period marked the moment when several players, looking back more recently, identified the first real signs of tension between the players and Kathy Engelbert. And a big part of that tension centered around activism during the bubble. Now, this is one of those topics where everyone has their own opinion. Some people believe sports should stay separate from politics or activism. Others feel that athletes have every right to use their platform to speak on issues they care about. Wherever you land on that debate, the reality is that WNBA players were pushing Engelbert hard during the bubble to allow them to visibly display their activism. That pressure mattered, and according to the article, it played a role in shaping the dynamic between the league office and the players going forward. From there, let's fast forward to February of 2022, which is another major inflection point. This is when the WNBA announced its capital raise. New investors, along with existing WNBA and NBA owners, injected $75 million into the league. That money was specifically meant to supercharge business growth, improve marketing, and drive innovation. This is where the revenue split conversation really starts to get complicated, and why it's not as simple as just saying, pay the players more. The current ownership structure matters. 42% of the WNBA is owned by the league itself. Another 42% is owned by the NBA. And the remaining 16% is owned by this investor group that came in during that capital raise. Now, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to criticize that decision. But we also have to remember where the WNBA was in 2022. The league was not doing well financially. Losses were piling up. From that perspective, this capital raise may not have been a bad decision at all. It may have been necessary just to keep the league alive, to prevent folding teams, or to avoid selling off franchises simply to stay afloat. I've talked to people who are far deeper inside WNBA circles than I am, and a lot of them will tell you that Cathy Engelbert has made decisions that quite literally saved the league in certain moments. That doesn't mean every decision was perfect. It doesn't mean she's above criticism. But it does add important context. Because yes, now we can look back and say that selling off 16% of league equity complicates the revenue split discussions and potentially limits how much money flows directly to players. That part is undeniable. But the flip side of that question is this. If she hadn't done it, would the WNBA even be in the position it's in today? Would the league have survived long enough to benefit from the Caitlin Clark era and the surge in interest we're seeing now? That's where I've personally had to reflect. I've come down hard on Engelbert in the past, multiple times, and I still believe there are things she could have handled better. But after reading this article and looking at the full timeline, maybe it wasn't all bad. Maybe some of these moves were decisions made out of necessity, not preference. That also ties back to the NBA's role. The NBA has supported the WNBA for years, and the WNBA has needed that support. And honestly, that's okay to say out loud. The goal isn't dependency forever. The goal is to eventually reach a point where the WNBA can stand fully on its own. Maybe that's 5 years away, maybe it's longer. They're just not there yet. Last year alone, the league still posted significant losses, especially with added expenses like charter flights and other operational upgrades. So, while the momentum is real, the financial reality is still very much a work in progress.
But anyway, I just wanted to put this out there because I might have been wrong on some of my takes a few months ago when it came to Cathy Engelbert. Looking back now, that capital raise may have been exactly what the WNBA needed at that moment in time. It's easy to judge decisions once the league starts gaining momentum, but when you rewind the clock, the circumstances were very different. That brings us to March of 2022, when the New York Liberty were fined for illicit chartering. And honestly, this part feels almost unbelievable when you compare it to where the WNBA is today. Reports came out in early March 2022 that the Liberty had been fined $500,000 for chartering flights to away games during the second half of the 2021 season. On top of that, there were other violations, including an unsanctioned team trip to Napa, California. What's wild is that this kind of thing is pretty common overseas. And I know there's always been a lot of discourse around the idea that players can make more money overseas than they can in the WNBA. That's not entirely true. Yes, some top-tier players can make significant money overseas, sometimes even more than their WNBA salary. But for middle-tier and lower-tier players, they're often making less overseas than they would in the WNBA.
A perfect example of this is Diana Taurasi. Russia famously paid her $1 million to skip the WNBA season and play exclusively overseas. But here's the key part. No one else on that team was making $1 million. That deal existed because it was Diana Taurasi. Her talent, her name, and the attention she brought made her worth that investment. That's not the norm. That's the exception. And this is where things start to look similar to what we may see with Project B. When you don't have hard salary caps or strict league-wide rules, and you've got wealthy owners running individual teams, they can pretty much do whatever they want. They can pay whoever they want, however much they want. That's how overseas leagues operate. Some teams charter everywhere. Some stay in luxury hotels. Others don't. Naturally, players want to land on those top-tier teams. Better travel, better pay, better overall experience. But if you're stuck on a team flying commercial with multiple layovers while another team is flying private, that creates a completely uneven playing field. And that's why this whole situation feels ironic now. Back in 2022, the Liberty were fined heavily for chartering. Fast forward to today, and the WNBA is chartering flights for all teams. What was once a violation is now the standard. It really shows how fast things have changed for this league. Now we get to what is, without question, the most important part of this entire timeline, April 2024. Caitlin Clark is drafted into the WNBA, and the spotlight doesn't just increase, it explodes. The attention on the league goes from being this tiny little laser pointer you'd use to mess with your cat to one of those massive helicopter spotlights you see in crime movies when they're searching the city for someone on the run. You know exactly what I mean. That is what happened to the WNBA overnight. And I'm genuinely glad Alexa Philippou explicitly mentions this in the article, because at this point, we should just be honest about it. It's Caitlin Clark. It has always been Caitlin Clark. Yes, there are other talented young players who have entered the league. Yes, there are stars with strong fan bases. But when we're talking about something that fundamentally changes the trajectory of an entire league, this has been the Caitlin Clark effect. Plain and simple. You don't even have to look very hard to see it. Just look at Iowa's viewership. While Caitlin Clark was there, Iowa women's basketball became appointment viewing. Even after she left, people were still tuning into Iowa games at levels they never had before. Iowa was never near the top of women's basketball viewership before Caitlin Clark showed up. That residual interest exists because of her. She created fans who stayed. Now, take that same lens and apply it to the WNBA. Before Caitlin Clark was drafted, the Indiana Fever were third from last in attendance. That's just a fact. Then she arrives, and almost immediately the Fever jumped to number 1 in attendance, not just for one season, but for consecutive seasons. That is not coincidence. That is not marketing. That is not league-wide growth magically landing on one franchise. That is one player moving the needle in a way we almost never see. And this is where the comparison matters. When Angel Reese entered the league, the Chicago Sky were already a top 3 team in attendance the year before she arrived. After she joined, the Sky dropped into the bottom 5 in attendance over the next couple of seasons. That doesn't mean Angel Reese isn't popular. It doesn't mean she doesn't have fans. It simply shows that popularity and league-wide impact are not the same thing. That's why I always say this isn't about feelings. It's not about liking or disliking a player. I could personally dislike Caitlin Clark, which I don't, and still be forced to admit the truth. The numbers don't lie. Attendance, viewership, engagement, merchandise. This is why we call it the Caitlin Clark effect. No other player has demonstrated this level of gravitational pull. No one else. Philippou even writes it directly. She says, "The fanfare Clark received from college carried over to the WNBA, which saw a historic year in attendance, viewership, and other key metrics." That's the admission right there. She does acknowledge that other college stars like Angel Reese and, more recently, 2025 number 1 pick Paige Buchers brought significant followings to the league. And I agree with that part. They did bring followings.
But here's where nuance matters. Not all followings translate to sustained viewership and attendance. We've seen that play out, and we're seeing it right now with Unrivaled. And to be clear, I'm not saying Unrivaled's viewership struggles are solely because of any one player. I don't think the product itself has been particularly compelling either. But we've literally seen moments where Caitlin Clark going golfing pulls more eyeballs than Unrivaled games. That tells you everything you need to know. Whatever Caitlin Clark does, people watch. No other player in women's basketball has that level of attention attached to them. Over time, though, it became clear that Clark wasn't just benefiting herself. She was a rising tide lifting all boats. The 2024 WNBA Finals between the Liberty and the Minnesota Lynx became the most watched finals in 25 years. That does not happen in a vacuum. What frustrates me is how long it took people to just admit it. 2.5 years of dancing around it. 2.5 years of pretending this surge just magically happened. Now, finally, we're saying it out loud. Yes, Caitlin Clark's arrival is why the league suddenly has leverage. It's why media companies cared. It's why numbers skyrocketed. The WNBA was growing steadily since 2020, no doubt about it. But it was incremental. It was a gradual upward slope. Then Caitlin Clark enters the league and the graph goes vertical, straight up. That's the difference. And honestly, I'm tired of repeating it. We should be past this by now. But when people still deny reality, it's hard not to keep addressing it. That growth leads directly into July 2024 when the WNBA secures a monumental media rights deal, an 11-year agreement worth $2.2 billion, roughly $200 million per year, with Disney, Amazon Prime, and NBC Universal. That deal does not happen without the surge in attention. It just doesn't. Then, in October 2024, players opt out of the previous CBA. In January 2025, Unrivaled officially launches. We talked a lot about Unrivaled yesterday, so I won't spend too much time here. Wear the shirts, say, pay us what you owe us. Fine, do what you need to do. But I do think effort matters. Overall, the All-Star experience was fun. The game itself was not. And then in September 2025, things really blew up with the public fallout between players and Kathy Engelbert. We covered that daily because it happened right before the WNBA Finals. It completely hijacked the conversation. On top of that, you had injuries. If Napheesa Collier doesn't get injured by Alyssa Thomas, does Minnesota make the finals? Maybe. And if they do, does that public back and forth even happen at that moment? I honestly think it gets delayed. Instead, it pulled attention away from the finals, which, if we're being honest, were not great anyway. The Aces swept Phoenix, there were more injuries, Satu Sabali had that scary concussion. The basketball itself didn't carry the moment. And that brings me to what I've said consistently. None of this matters if the product on the floor isn't good. None of it. Fans will stick around for novelty, they'll stick around for a star player, but that only lasts so long. Not every player is going to be in this league forever. At some point, the focus has to be on the quality of basketball. Because if you do that, the money comes, the viewership comes, the leverage comes. And finally, the last paragraph of the article brings us to where we are now. 3 months after her exit interview, Napheesa Collier said during Unrivaled preseason media availability that nothing has changed at the league level as the WNBA and the Players Union continue to work through ongoing CBA negotiations. That's the present moment. That's where we are. I'm going to stop here because this video has already gone long. This was supposed to be a lighter conversation, more of a look back at how we got here. A lot of people were talking about this article, so I wanted to walk through it with you and reflect on the timeline. Let me know what you think in the comments.
Don't forget, like and subscribe.